and important book. It started as a Queen's PhD and has developed into really important publication. So the book is Siblinghood and Sociability in 19th-Century Ulster. I'm here to speak about the book, where we celebrate it with drinks afterwards. Its author, Dr. Shannon Devlin, and also Professor Diane Urquhart. Diane's going to speak first after about 10-15 minutes.
Maybe 10.
She's the kind of warm-up act.
Happy to do that.
So I'm sure people know that. She's Professor of Gender History here at Queen's, has written very widely on women's experience in Irish society and Irish politics from the 18th century to the more recent past, including a major prize-winning book on divorce in Irish history. Shannon holds her PhD here from Queen's, so it's great to have her back. She's currently lecturer in modern Irish history at Galway University, having previously taught at Ulster University and here at Queen's. And her research interests lie in the Irish middle classes, 19th century Ireland, and family migration, using family relationships to explore sociability, reputation, and the gendered expectations of middle class society. Siblinghood and Sociability in 19th century Ulster, which is published by Liverpool University Press, is her first monograph. And we have here for anyone who might be interested in a copy later. But Diane's going to start off by giving us an overview of the book.
Lovely, thanks so much, Peter. Afternoon, everyone. You brought the sun with you, which is a great thing. It's a real pleasure to be launching this brilliant book this afternoon, recently published by Liverpool University Press, and attractive displays here. It is for sale at a special discounted price of, I'll say it quickly, £75. And Shannon will take hard cash or any sort of payment at all. But as Peter said, Shannon completed her PhD here at Queen's under the primary supervision of Professor Elaine Farrell, who is here, and that was in 2022. Since then, Shannon has been a Bach Fellow at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, working on a project looking at the role of migrant siblings in creating a transatlantic network of correspondence as well as support. From 2022 to 24, she was a lecturer in history at the University of Ulster, and she is currently, as Peter said, lecturer in history at the University of Galway, and they're very lucky to have her. Also the pleasure of sitting with Shannon on the Executive Committee of the Women's History Association of Ireland, and she's also very active in the Social History Society. This fine book is Shannon's first monograph, and I had the pleasure of examining this in its first incarnation as a PhD thesis. And there we could see its originality and Shannon's ability to mine, we might think is maybe traditional family history sources, but from a very different perspective. She has a brilliant eye for historical detail. Anyone who has looked at the book will be aware from that. And she's a brilliant storyteller and a really sensitive historian, and that really allows the lived experience of many siblings in 19th century Ulster to emerge to the fore. And there are really important themes that emerge because of this brilliant way that she's approached the theme of siblings. So power, gender, emotion, all encircle what I think is a really important book. And it is the first sibling study of its type, and it explores 25 sets of middle-class siblings from a whole array of backgrounds, so rural and urban, and also a whole range of religious backgrounds. And it's so interesting to read, but Quakers, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Catholic Church of Ireland, Methodists are all in there, and sometimes having very similar experiences, sometimes having very distinct ones because of their geographical placing or religious belief. And I think one of the key things that the book does is broaden out our association between middle class status and Presbyterians in Ulster. We see a lot more groupings of different religions emerging in this piece of work. The middle class household that emerges is also much more fluid than fixed, which again I think is a very important finding for us. Siblings move in and out of more than one household, and again Shannon tracks this brilliantly as she moves through. Various stages of the life cycle impact on that experience. And sometimes either through choice or lack of an alternative, sub-siblings remain in their original household for life. Others go wide and far, but that sibling connection remains in some shape or form. And sometimes we have more than one household coming together, spanned by groups of siblings. That becomes obviously more pronounced when siblings marry and the households multiply, as does the family size. Others who were unmarried, and that becomes obviously much more common in the 19th century as we see changes in inheritance patterns and the associated link between dowry payments. Some just stay in that household of their childhood for life, and that becomes so commonplace that some heirs were instructed to care for those unmarried siblings by will. And again, Shannon has really, I think, creatively explored wills, which can, I think, first glance look a little bit unpromising, but actually, again, from this different perspective, emerge as a brilliant source and tells us a lot about expectation, about what your role as an heir was. It went beyond that family home and stretched into the household to care with those who wouldn't have households of their own. And for those who stayed living with their siblings, they could provide companionship, help with childcare, running in that middle class home, all emerges through lots of those sets of siblings for those who stayed. And I mentioned Shannon uses wills in a really creative way, but she also complements this with a whole array of sources. And I remember commenting on this during your Viva. You probably don't remember. You were yeah, maybe thinking about other things, but diaries, the correspondence is really rich and wonderful. The press, your use of the census is fantastic. Medical and political records, they're all in there. And sometimes it's just little snippets. But again, put together, then we start to see something really fantastic happening. The period that Shannon's looking at obviously sees Ulster in a period of transition and often fairly fast social and economic transformation. And at first glance, we might think that that led to only upward mobility. But again, from what Shannon's looking at, we're seeing how that also leads to downward social mobility. So there were winners and there were losers, and all of that impacts on the children in various families within the middle classes. This is also a period that witnessed a greater degree of familial containment, particularly of women and children within the home. But family was also the medium through which individuals enter society. So it has this interesting dual role, and people transition often in different ways and at different stages. And reading it through, I was reminded of a book that I'd read a few years ago, published in 1829. Don't all rush for this one, but this is James Mill's analysis of the phenomenon of the human mind. I know, actually much more interesting than it sounds. And he tries to define the family at that early point in the 19th century. And he calls the family the group and delineates them by saying they don't have servants. He also comments on the affection between brothers and sisters, and that's what really kind of sprang to my attention. I was reading this through, Shannon, and he wrote that that group, the family, possessed, and I quote, most of the ingredients which go into the formation of friendship, is how he sort of defines this sibling relationship. And that bond is certainly evident in Shannon's study, but as the gender historian Leonor Davidoff has commented, and some of us may have direct experience of this, sibling relationships can, as she puts it, repel as well as attract. I should offer some counselling later on, perhaps, for that, but I think that's a really sage warning, that we shouldn't assume any commonality in sibling experience. And the siblings were, as you say in the introduction, Shannon, loved, despised, celebrated, and taken for granted in equal measure. I think that's a brilliant summation of the various forms that the sibling relationship can take. And regardless of any of that, the sibling relationship was really central to lived experience, creating relationships that outlived relationships with parents or children, for example. Parental death, marital desertion, or marital dissolution and remarriage adds even more complexity to the sibling relationship because, of course, it creates both step and half siblings. In addition, on marriage, siblings-in-law then would join the family circle, or the arrival of a new sibling, again, and Shannon charts numerous examples of this, could alter those household dynamics in a really significant way. So a feted younger child was effectively usurped, and as Shannon brilliantly observes, this means that, I'm going to quote you directly here, relationships with the home were always in flux. And that's a hard thing for us to capture historically, but this book does it very, very well. The sibling relationship also varies at different stages of life, and say immaturity often is spanning multiple households. And as the late David Fitzpatrick noted, many Irish families at this point were, as he put it, uncomfortably large. And in Shannon's sample, we see the average number of siblings coming up at 7, but it could be as high as 13. And that resulted in really sizable age gaps between youngest and eldest siblings. I think the longest is 30 years in difference, so literally a generation, between the youngest and the eldest. And added to that, we've got to think about miscarriages as well as high infant mortality. And that contributed even further sometimes to those age gaps. And intriguingly, in Shannon's sample, spacing between children varies from 18 months up to 2 years. And reading that, I was thinking about miscarriages that we may not know about, for example, or unregistered infant deaths, certainly up to the 1860s and more realistically well into the 1870s. We weren't going to capture all of those. But even with that, did that raise the method of some form of spacing of families? You don't have to answer that now, but I was really interested in that. Circumstances could also impact on relationships between siblings and the responsibilities that they take within the family home. And Shannon gives a really moving account of the Davis siblings of Belfast who were orphaned, and that pivots the elder sisters, Jane and Sarah, into maternal roles. And that's even though the family's been taken in by their aunt and uncle. Their younger brother, Tom, writes in 1863 that his sister Sarah subsequently became, as he put it, more than a mother to him. But she was just 3 years his senior. So again, this isn't a family where we have these huge gaps, but again, her placing in the family really impacts on her lived experience, but also her relationship with him, which he then remembers really fondly. Sibling relationships could also, of course, cross geographical boundaries, and given the scale of the Irish diaspora, I think this is particularly marked. And again, we have examples of these, relationships that are, really quite spread out at times, but yet the connection often remains. So there's something, I think, unique about that sibling relationship. Placing amongst siblings, of course, also dictated life opportunities beyond that migratory movement. I think, again, particularly from the middle of the 19th century onwards, when we have inheritance and dowry payments, usually the preserve of the eldest sons and daughters, respectively. So middle siblings could then feed into that migrant outflow pressure, sometimes on younger siblings to stay at home and care for elder parents. So again, not all siblings had the same experience in the one household, of course. And this book really embraces that complexity, and I think it's one of its key strengths. And it sits as an important body of work, which is asking hard, really challenging questions about the dynamics of the Irish family. Also, its individual members and the role that the family plays in the exertion of both agency and power. And those are questions that we haven't asked fully before. So I think this is a really timely book, and as I say, answering difficult and important questions, but also raising some as well. So this book is a really important contribution in its exploration of households, education, courtship and matchmaking, work and inheritance and socialisation, big themes like equality, gendered social mores, reputation, identity and duty, and the list goes on and all emerge. So we can tell so much about lived experience in the middle classes in Ulster from this text. And as a closing point, it left me why, and again, you don't have to answer this, but why we've overlooked siblings, not just in Ireland's past, but they are relatively understudied right across the board for so long, because they can tell us a lot. And as I say, the sources seem to be there and seem to be very rich. So before Shannon might choose to answer that question or not, can we warmly congratulate her on this wonderful achievement of siblinghood and sociability?
Thank you very much. So yeah, this is my first book and like first book launch as well. So this is a very strange environment. I know most of the people in the room, which is also quite terrifying actually to present this. But yeah, today I kind of wanted to talk sort of maybe about kind of my approach to my book, or kind of where kind of how I got into it, and I suppose kind of which Dan's really highlighted there, kind of this kind of real fragmentary aspect to the sources and kind of using this genealogical kind of approach. And I suppose, yeah, it's really lovely to be doing this here, because this is where kind of this research started. If anybody has read the acknowledgements, Elaine will know that this kind of started when Elaine very kindly took me on as a master's student about 10 years ago now, which is scary. But essentially this kind of sparked from one of my master's dissertation, where I looked at wanted to look at kind of middle class girlhood and adolescence, and I realised that I was using the Richardson family from Bessbrook in County Armagh, County Down, depending on kind of your stance on the border. But essentially I was looking at these really interesting kind of letters between sisters who were writing to each other in their kind of childhood and adolescence. And the Richardson family is really interesting because, first of all, they're Quakers, so they have this kind of unprecedented kind of massive archive of letters and research that's been kind of kept, and which I later found out there was even more of this in the Friends Society Library down in Dublin. But also they're coming from this kind of emerging or expanding middle class kind of elite by the end of the 19th century. You know, they're kind of making their money through kind of massive linen expansion. So you have this kind of huge archive of business records that are being held in Prony, but as you can see, a lot of it is uncatalogued, and a lot of it not only is uncatalogued but is a complete mess in the boxes. Hopefully no one is an archivist from Prony here. But it kind of dawned on me that essentially that there's, you know, kind of not only is the Richardson family from a kind of cataloguing point of view, not really thought about kind of the women in the family, but it's also kind of very much taken from a kind of very business or industrial kind of point of view for their presence in the linen industry. And as I kind of came towards the end of that research, then I realised that there's so much kind of family gossip essentially in these letters that are kind of back and forth between multiple members of the family, but also kind of tell you a lot about brother and sister relationships, sibling relationships, and kind of this relationship between different generations. So I talk a lot about kind of horizontal relationships, but also diagonal family relationships, and kind of thinking about the importance of the extended family in kind of family sort of situations, but also in those kind of wider, you know, kind of financial and kind of emotional sort of supportive, or kind of the need for a family support network. And essentially that's kind of sparked my thought. Originally I was wanting to look at kind of correspondence, and then I had conversation actually leaving this room and kind of I did a lot of chasing people up and down University Square, but I chased Muriel out up the street, and essentially had a conversation with her, and she suggested that I look at the actual sibling relationship, and kind of thinking about the role of brothers and sisters in the family and in society. And this is because, or kind of as this research developed, kind of the stereotypical Irish family in the 19th century is large with lots of siblings, but yet they're kind of really understudied or kind of on the periphery of a lot of different kind of historical conversations when we think about the family. Brothers and sisters grow up usually in similar socio-economic circumstances, experiencing, in theory, the same moral and religious teaching, living with the same family reputation, social status, and geographical privilege. Yet the paths that siblings take or can be forced down often diverge. And as Diane has mentioned, Lenore Davidoff kind of really pushed this kind of argument of looking at siblings because they give us a really good insight into kind of how society changes over the course of a life cycle, and the fact that kind of brothers and sisters do, in kind of practical terms, experience the longest relationship out of any family relationship, just due to kind of generational differences. So siblings in an Irish context kind of pop up in the periphery of kind of demography or population studies, and kind of has emerged sort of in kind of the Western, in Britain and the United States, as a kind of a new way to look at the society and family. Essentially, siblings provide, kind of the space for socialization, the negotiation of gender dynamics, and kind of form these foundational familial and emotional bonds. But in a kind of Irish context, the family's kind of looked at from a number of different angles, kind of including pregnancy, parenthood, and childhood, and kind of taking these stages maybe more separately rather than kind of combined in a kind of a life cycle approach. And the family in general is sort of taken, especially through kind of the influential study of kind of Arnsberg and Kimball's, kind of study of County Clare, which has really kind of prioritised this idea of the STEM family and kind of this idea of, or the position of siblings sort of in different stages. So first of all, they're kind of thought of as the sons and daughters of kind of the head of the family, and this kind of idea of, the sort of patriarch. And then they're thought of as brothers and sisters of the inheriting child, often relegated to their capacity to marry or to not marry, to remain dependent or to kind of be able to sort of support themselves. Again, this kind of like this real link or assumption of kind of the family as something that's contained in one household, which I think that hopefully my book kind of really expands the idea of fluid households and kind of being kind of a member of multiple households, or that where you physically live doesn't kind of exclude you from kind of the broader extended family. And then finally, then taking this kind of sort of generational view, then siblings are kind of seen as mostly the single aunts or uncles of the next generation of that really juicy sources. There's massive amounts of gossip in them. So they can show kind of this idea of traditional gender and expectation, but also in kind of the family business or sort of financial decision making. You can also see where families can kind of go against gender convention as well. That the kind of the safety of the family can also present opportunities to go against social kind of conventions. Brothers and sisters are important in navigating these kind of gender power structures, learning emotional intelligence and boundaries. And really kind of important in establishing connections with different sections of society. So be that geographically, generationally, or in different gendered environments, especially thinking about kind of friendship circles that are created through kind of different experiences of schooling and kind of the actual different aspects of society, you know, kind of sports, associational culture that people are involved in. Importantly, though, brothers and sisters are kind of taking a sibling approach also shows that the expectation that family will always be there can also make it kind of like a target for blackmail or sort of manipulation from those inside and outside the sibling set, which there's a number of kind of examples of that. For example, Edward Wakefield, you know, takes his sisters to court over a kind of trust issue, kind of financial issue, and then when that doesn't work, then he starts to kind of slander both his brothers-in-law in kind of the press, again in because they're Quakers, kind of it becomes a very kind of personal and public kind of attack, and the expectation there is that they will be so worried and concerned about their financial and, you know, the reputation of their family business that they will essentially give in to this kind of blackmail and kind of forgo these family bonds for, you know, kind of for his benefit. But actually what happens is then it causes a massive rift in the family, and they all fall out, and he's really shocked, and, you know, that his two brothers-in-law, you know, kind of they're also brothers. So, you know, kind of, you know, he's kind of should have a diagram before I start talking about this. But he's really shocked then that they're willing to kind of hold on to those family bonds to the detriment of their kind of their public reputation, and if they lose out financially. And, you know, his house in County Armagh, Cloncore, is kind of in them actual, you know, kind of essentially falling down around him because he essentially squanders all the money. But anyway, that's buy the book when you can find it. And so secondly then, I hope then the book then explores how these family dynamics then what they mean in society. So how do siblings impact family reputation, both positively and negatively, the importance of family networks in philanthropic and political movements, especially at the end of the 19th century when there is so much social and political kind of change, and also the upholding of Victorian ideology and these kind of religious and moral teachings. So how do the family police each other, and then also then how does that impact then the policing of other people and other classes, especially in society? But also then where do these boundaries blur, and kind of where can families sort of I suppose shirk the sort of the teaching that they're so I suppose dogmatic about kind of in public, and kind of how does that change within to suit themselves within the family? It aims to shed new light on both rural and urban middle class networks, especially demonstrating where they overlap, and how kind of mobile the middle classes were. And an unexpected outcome of this book, so my PhD was based on Protestant families in Ulster, but I was able to expand and look at Catholic families as well, which is kind of had to take a kind of a new approach. So that's also one thing that I think this kind of genealogical approach can kind of prove, that maybe families or groups in society that don't leave the same sort of traditional archival record can actually be identified, and essentially, you know, kind of taking this family approach, you can kind of at least at the very minimum kind of say they were there. So, you know, kind of thinking about the kind of the smaller Catholic middle class families at where they intersect and overlap and kind of agree on lots of things from that kind of middle class ideology, even though they're from Catholic and Protestant backgrounds, and especially by the time of Home Rule, might disagree kind of on various political things quite differently. So the kind of the book looks at this sort of approach through these different themes, and it considers 25 sets of siblings then from the middle classes based in the 9 counties of Ulster. So as I say, I attempted to kind of look at all 9 counties, kind of both urban and rural backgrounds, but this can kind of get quite complicated as a lot of families kind of move about inside Ulster, but also outside Ulster, out in Ireland and then abroad. And also then increasing opportunities and kind of diversification away from land from the start of the 19th century, and kind of more involvement in both the professional classes and the industrialisation of Ulster. You have a kind of a huge kind of degree of mobility and back and forth between both urban and rural. And so these are the families that I look at, and as Diane said, that the largest confirmed set is 13, with the O'Neill family, and the smallest is the Davis brothers, just numbering 2. But the kind of a huge caveat here is that this is because I don't have any records proving that there's other siblings in that kind of sibling set. The likelihood is that there is, but it's either they didn't survive to adulthood, or if they had a sister then that they changed name. And this kind of really represents kind of the major hurdle in this kind of approach, which also I would argue is the most interesting kind of source-wise or research-wise, in that creating a family tree in the Irish context can be quite difficult, especially the further back you go. So missing siblings, particularly sisters who marry and change name, can disappear out of the historical record altogether. The legal requirement to register births, marriages and deaths didn't come into 1864. But as Diane pointed out, this can, there's really right up to 1900, there's still kind of a lot of issues with kind of registration of families. Limitations to the record keeping or survival mean that I've kind of had to piece together siblings from contextual clues, either within the family collections themselves, or really kind of taking this, essentially doing an entire family tree to ensure that I've kind of included everybody, or as many people as I can. And this was really benefited from the kind of mass digitization of genealogical records that has occurred kind of very recently, especially through sites like Ancestry, who's kind of essentially also funding this, the ability to digitize these records from institutions and archives kind of across the world. So census, newspaper records, and migration records have been really useful in kind of tracing individuals outside of Ireland, but also kind of shows the range of different source material that we can use to kind of essentially piece together the records that have been lost in an Irish context. So through the fire of the Four Courts, or the kind of the destruction of census records, and kind of argue or kind of point that these people did live in Ireland at one point before they kind of move away. So despite this kind of like new wave of speculative biography that's kind of also becoming really, really kind of popular at the moment, I didn't include my own family in this, even though that they kind of really informed my genealogical approach and kind of obsession, honestly, to do these family trees. But because of there's kind of this really interesting kind of I suppose discussion over kind of who owns a family history, or kind of who can tell a family story. So for that reason, then all of these families do have some publicly, or mostly publicly accessible family collections in traditional archives. And this is kind of where I suppose more problematic aspect of kind of pulling together these kind of fragmentary sources can be, because as Emma Rothschild kind of argues, a family's history is kind of a sequence of incomplete stories, and kind of you are essentially kind of coming at these families through different kind of specific pockets of time, and depending on what kind of records exist. So, for example, just to point out. So for example, this is the Cunningham, or this is the family Bible page from the Cunningham set of siblings, who I had, thought I had locked down, thinking here's, there's so many brothers and sisters. And then I go to Edinburgh and go into the archive and then find this and find that there's actually 4 other siblings that had been born and had died in infancy. So they're registered then without kind of impacting kind of the traditional historical record. And also in all of the surviving correspondence to the Cunningham siblings, they're not mentioned. So you also have this kind of dealing with this kind of like absence of, or kind of raises lots of nice kind of questions about the silences in archives as well, and kind of actually how taking this genealogical or horizontal approach can start to kind of put other people back into the historical record. But most of the kind of the sources then are kind of pulled together from this sort of fragmentary kind of aspect. And information about kind of the experiences of individuals is gleaned through correspondence and family letters, personal writing, testamentary material, but also empty envelopes, bills and invoices, recipes, photographs, school books, blotting paper, objects, hair, you name it. If it's in a family collection, you can really kind of start to kind of piece together an idea of how these families lived and interacted with each other. And also collections denote, or what's kind of became increasingly important and more important now that the book's out, is kind of thinking about how collections, especially so many of these collections, are archived or thought about from a kind of industrial, business or political point of view, but actually how we can go back maybe and think about these different archival collections from a different point of view. And this is kind of one of the benefits of taking a kind of family approach to sort of reevaluate what sources we actually do have in archives. And also kind of thinking about these letters, you can kind of, because of this idea of kind of gossip about everybody, you actually find out a lot about kind of, kind of neighbours, other sets of siblings that are not maybe, the siblings of the person that is writing the letter, if that makes sense, the to and the from. So there's a real kind of broad sweep of sources that are in this book. So what was I going to say? For example, yeah, I can't really remember. But essentially then the other kind of aspect of this is that the kind of the traditional source base of letters and diaries and things that got there need to be kind of augmented with this kind of broad kind of reach into the genealogical archive. So for example, you have valuation books, the like Prony's re-evaluation books. You can kind of see the kind of the step of how land is passed towards each other, the use of the census. You can have really interesting kind of, or sort of details that kind of start to emerge from genealogical records. So for example, the death registration of the O'Neill sisters, who died a day after each other in Strabane in 1875, kind of really shows kind of how kind of living conditions and the experiences of families can really differ along this kind of broad sweep that I've really took for the middle classes, which I can talk about in the Q&A, kind of like who is kind of included within these boundaries. But also you have kind of the marriage registrations of Mary Bushell and John Stevely in both the Church of Ireland and the Roman Catholic Church, which is kind of highlighting then this kind of idea of mixed marriage within middle classes, and the kind of the emergence or kind of the movement of kind of middle class groups. So they came from Limerick to Dublin to Belfast at the start of the 19th century. And taking this these kind of, I suppose, non-traditional or more genealogical records can also really kind of highlight other aspects of kind of the lived experiences of these families. So you have both the Maguire and O'Neill families listed in the Strabane street directory. So for example, this is a really interesting example because the two Maguire brothers think that they're going to essentially they have a grocery shop in the 1840s that's owned by their mother, or has been given to their mother, and then they decide that they're going to make it kind of big in the Australian gold rush. So they kind of off they go to Australia. You know, they realise that they're not going to make it big, but of course before they go, they sell the family business, and their three sisters are kind of left, you know, to their own devices. But actually, when in their absence, two of the sisters buys the family business back and kind of creates a bigger empire. So then when the two brothers eventually come back, but this time they've also fell out in Australia, and when they come back to Strabane, essentially they find that their sisters, the three sisters, have kind of created this sort of financially secure situation back in Strabane, and they have to kind of work their way back into it. And so that's another, they all have to get the priest involved and, all this sort of stuff. So this was one of the examples I was really delighted to kind of come across, because it was kind of an example of a Catholic family that was, might have been in the kind of the lower middle classes, but are trying to essentially establish themselves within this kind of hierarchy. And then a few other examples that kind of popped up, this was all through kind of ancestry, is Ben Bushell, who essentially is tried for murder and is sentenced to execution. And there's kind of a long and lengthy petition that's signed by his brother-in-law in Belfast, and kind of a who's who of kind of influential Belfast names, that he the petition is granted, and he's not sentenced to death. And then also kind of this the value of probation or probate and testamentary papers that have been digitized online. So especially Australia and America have really kind of digitized a lot of will material that gives you a lot of information about the family that has remained in Ireland, and kind of the financial implications or kind of setup of those families that is not in any kind of archival records in Belfast or Dublin. So essentially, kind of again piecing these sorts of ideas together. So this again, to kind of really kind of quickly sort of go over this is this kind of idea of the families that are sort of from a kind of broad sweep of the middle classes, and how their kind of financial situation doesn't always link up with their social position, or the ability to kind of remain kind of upwardly mobile socially, with maybe not the financial background, and that they kind of by the end of the 19th century have really amassed a huge amount of wealth, and kind of thinking about kind of the importance of siblings in that. So for example, the Richardsons, who grew up in these two massive houses, but because they had 10 children, and they decided that one of these houses weren't enough, so they continually move back and forth between these. I mean, they're pretty big houses. So compared to then, as I say, the O'Neill siblings, who are residing above their haberdashery shop in Strabane, and then once the two older sisters get married, then all of their families, like the two grandchildren essentially, are born in the same family. So again, that there's kind of different or varied lived experiences. But also a theme that came out really strongly throughout the book is this kind of idea of, or want to kind of remain close together. And sometimes that is practically, like if the land or the farm is split between two people, then that's why they're going to be living in the same kind of lane or whatever. But there is this kind of intention of, like, by the end of the life cycle, or kind of as you age and kind of rear your family, to kind of return to kind of connections with your brothers and sisters. So for example, the Donaldson family, who grew up in this kind of very rural, isolated house at Fort Hill, which is outside Clontibret in County Monaghan, by 1892, all three of them, of the remaining siblings, had kind of in their 70s and 80s had moved with their families to Belfast. And you can see that they picked houses very close together, to the point where there's two of them that could actually see each other from the bedroom windows. And kind of again, this kind of idea of remaining in close proximity, or desire to retain kind of that friendship or that closeness with each other. And I feel like I'm now rambling, so I feel like I'll probably draw this to a close. But And this is kind of another example then is, so this is Queen's here, but this is the Prof siblings of Chlorine. So their houses are no longer here, but I found this photograph, and a will sets aside or states that there's 5 houses to be built, and they're built identically. And here you can see them beside the David Care building, that they are actually 5 identical kind of houses for each of the 5 siblings to live in on Chlorine. So just again, that kind of idea of how sibling relationships or that kind of bond can be across multiple households, and that kind of this idea of like imagined households where people are kind of living socially together. Yeah, I'll probably not talk too much about this, but just want to say that so most of this research came from archives, and kind of digging through kind of family trees and genealogically myself. But I just want to kind of, I suppose, finish off with a thanks to all the actual descendants of these families that I'm not a member of, because essentially, yeah, I went kind of digging, which I get some curious and really interesting messages on my Ancestry account from lots of people who think I am like their 4th cousin once removed, which I'm actually not. But it has also thrown up some really interesting kind of opportunities to think about families who aren't kind of in the records, or to kind of this idea of to kind of go looking for them. So my example is the McLaughlin sisters of Belfast. So their descendant very kindly sent me this photograph. This is also via Elaine, a connection there. But of the 5 McLaughlin sisters who were dubbed the 5 Diamonds of Ulster, and essentially don't really appear kind of too much, except Emily is married Charles Gavin Duffy in the beginning of the 19th century. And essentially just kind of this idea of that there's so much kind of opportunity and kind of promise in kind of taking this sort of family approach into kind of looking at different sort of social kind of experiences. Yeah, their brother also was like ruined the entire family as well. So he like absconded to Savannah in Georgia, and had to come back for a court case and things like that there. But again, you can pick that up in the book. So I think I've talked enough probably, but yeah, so just to kind of round off with kind of this research has been really fun, essentially, at that in the kind of long run. And I think taking this kind of family approach and kind of horizontal and diagonal approach can tell us lots about lots of different themes across kind of social history or social society in the 19th century, and raises a lot of opportunities in actually kind of the way that we can reevaluate sources. So thanks. Plug for the book.
Shannon, thank you. And gave us a lovely flavour. Shannon's happy to take a couple of questions before we let you loose on the wine that's at the back of the room. Does anyone want to start us off? Yes, we go here, and then I'll come to Sophie.
Do you have a favourite family, or was there anything that you really enjoyed?
Yeah, so I think at various points I've been like, my favourite has been each one of them. But and yeah, and doing the kind of the family tree, it's been a real, I mean, I don't know if this is actually good or not, but there is aspects where you get so invested in them, it nearly feels like they are my own family, like some of them. And you see, when I find a photograph of one of them, like I am ecstatic. You would think that it's my own family member. But I think that they're really, yeah, all of them are brilliant. I think because I've looked at the Catholic families most recently, I feel like I'm really kind of in the trenches with them, and kind of I love the fact that we've got this photograph or this miniature of the 5 McLaughlin sisters, because I think it just gives you such good insight into a family where you don't have any other images of them. But my actual favourite person, I think, is Anne Wakefield Richardson, who is she kind of changes the perspective of her parents on education, and she really pushes. So they're Quakers. They think that their children, especially the girls, shouldn't go to public school or kind of school outside the house. So she kind of really pushes the boundaries at this, and then ends up going to, just for a whim, because she has the semester free, she goes to Newham College at Cambridge because someone gives her a room, which again is also wild. And she does really, really well there, and then she ends up becoming a lecturer in classics, and she's until into the 1920s and 30s, she is the vice principal of Westfield College, which later becomes Queen Mary College, or Queen Mary University in London. And essentially she kind of becomes this really focal point in the family, changing like education in for the rest of her sisters after them, even though they don't go as far as getting a degree in, I should say, in the 1880s this is. But also she becomes this like focal point. Her family essentially want to give her, because her brother has been in a mental asylum, they want to give her the kind of the entire family business, and she's like, no, I want to continue teaching. And then because she remains single, she kind of has this sort of really interesting dynamic with all of her siblings and kind of matchmaking them, kind of being that agony aunt, which she actually hates, and is kind of in this really awkward position. And then the last kind of way, or reason I find her so interesting, is this is Constance Maynard, who is in the middle of the photograph, who is the principal of Westfield College, and kind of her best friend, and then later becomes her sister-in-law. But essentially and Constance Maynard writes a really comprehensive diary, but there is 10 years of her diary missing, and in these 10 years, Anne, Constance and Ralph Gray have this, which I think we can be pretty confident in saying, romantic and probably sexual relationship. And I just find this so interesting because there's multiple kind of family dynamics happening, and there's issues with sexuality and kind of education and the kind of the source reason. I just find her really, really like fascinating. And so I think she'd be like my favorite person, if you can have a favorite person.
Okay. And Sophie had a question here.
Okay.
One of the
yeah.
One of our offices.
So I've done whoever or everybody on the University Square, so we can talk about that separately. But I looked at two families. I suppose I was especially interested in the ones so you have the Crawfords who lived in Chlorine, you have the Workmans lived at 6 Queen's Elms, which is where the union is at the minute. One of the Workmans moved to, I think it was University Square was renumbered, so at the time it was 17, but I think it's now where QFT is. And then the other family is Duffins, who lived on 2 houses, so they're born at the end of the street where the blue plaque is, and then they moved to 22, which and they lived there for about 10 years. And yeah, like I love that because it's, we're sitting in somebody's drawing room at the minute, and that's also a kind of a dynamic to that. The Duffins had a key to Botanic Gardens. The Duffin sisters, the older ones, were allowed to just go into the library, just because they lived on University Square, even though like none of their family, were involved in Queen's like academically, or like as teachers or lecturers or anything like that there. But those are the 2 main families.
Thank you. Any closing questions before we let Shannon off the hook? There's always one. Eamon. No.
I'm thinking from a literary. I mean, what you made me do is sit here thinking about Irish writing of the 19th and 20th centuries. Yeah. And the couple of things I can think of. The one novel that concentrates on siblings is Finnegans Wake, for a start. Okay. Yeah. Elizabeth Ball and Frank Connor, to take examples, favour the only child. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I can think of about siblings is Mary Bretton's Springs of Affection, in which a surviving sister regards her brother and twin, who has married out of the natal family, as a traitor for marrying out of the natal family. But you made me think about Irish writing from this perspective, for which I thank you, because it's an entirely new approach to it. Not really a question, more a comment.
Yeah, that's a bit,
Proposing question.
yeah,
No, but an important one.
yeah, that's a complimentary
Mhm.
comment. Yeah, yeah. Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Can we just thank Shannon for a wonderful talk and a fabulous script?
Wonderful. We do have some drinks over here. Please stay and have a drink and share with Shannon, the celebrator. But just before everyone disappears, it is kind of quite a busy couple of weeks. So we've got 2 more talks in the Irish Studies seminar series. On Thursday this week, we have our visiting global Irish scholar. I think that's the right term, Sean, isn't it? That's a faculty thing. Professor Sean Farrell from Northern Illinois University is with us for a couple of weeks. Sean's going to talk about his current research on sanitary reform and politics of public health in Victoria and Belfast. So that'll be in this room at 4 p.m. on Thursday of this week. So please come along if you can. And then our final Irish Studies seminar, regular seminar, is next Tuesday, not on Monday because it's a bank holiday, next Tuesday at 4:30 in this room. We have Kieran O'Neill from Trinity College Dublin talking about his new book on the title, Power and Powerlessness in Union Ireland, Life in what's called Life in a Palliative State. Okay, so that'll be 4:30 next Tuesday, the 6th of May. So please join us for one or other of those 2 events. Thank you again. Shall we retire to the other side of the room? Have some refreshments.